Pay attention to Zion Foster, 17 years old, captured on a neighbor's doorbell camera at 11:15 p.m. on January 4th, 2022. She is walking through a front door. She has less than 2 hours left to live because a man she called her favorite cousin is waiting for her on the other side of that door. A man who has been planning this moment for years. On this day, Zion wanted to spend time with someone she trusted completely. On this day, that man had one intention: to make sure she never left. This is the story of 105 minutes that destroyed a family forever. On the evening of January 4th, 2022, Zion had done everything right. She had finished her serving shift at the Detroit Wing Company and returned home. She then asked her mother, Sierra Milton, for permission to go out. She was honest about where she was going and who she would be with. Her favorite cousin, Jalen. Sierra had no reason to doubt her. Jalen was family. He had picked Zion up before, and Sierra had greeted him herself in the driveway on more than one occasion. She watched her eldest daughter walk out the door at shortly before 11 in the evening, fully expecting to see her walk back in before morning. She never did. When Zion's boyfriend, Vertez Gonzalez, reached out the following day asking if Sierra had heard from her, the mother's concern immediately shifted into something darker. He explained that the last text he received from Zion came in at midnight. On my way. After that, nothing. No response to his messages. No answer to his calls. Just silence. Sierra did what any terrified mother would do. She reached out to Jalen Brazier directly, and that is where everything unraveled. Jalen's response stopped her cold. He told Sierra that he had not been with Zion the night before. Not only that, but he claimed he had not seen or spoken to Zion in years. Years. He asked Sierra exactly how often Zion had been using him as a cover story, and when she told him once or twice a month, his frustration came through clearly in his messages. Zion's lies about him were sneaky as hell and not safe, he said. He suggested that she must have been spending time with someone who lived near him, using his name as an alibi while visiting someone else entirely. Sierra Milton knew immediately that he was lying. She had watched her daughter get into Jalen's car. She had seen his face in her driveway. She had hugged this man herself. His claim that they hadn't spoken in years was not just suspicious, it was impossible. And somewhere deep in her gut, Sierra knew that whatever had happened to her daughter, Jalen Brazier was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Vertez, insecure and desperate for answers, had been sending messages to Jalen as well. He confronted the 23-year-old with evidence he didn't even know was going to matter. In the weeks before Zion's disappearance, Vertez had shared location tracking on his phone with his girlfriend. On the night of January 4th, that tracking had placed Zion directly across the street from Jalen's home at 11:24 in the evening. Vertez had taken a screenshot at exactly that time, and he sent it to Jalen now, demanding an explanation. Jalen's response was calculated. He sent back a video from his Ring camera system, claiming it showed no entries or exits involving Zion. She was never there, he insisted. The camera proved it. But Sierra, when she reviewed that same footage, noticed something that sent chills through her. There were gaps in the entries for the night of January 4th. Footage appeared to be missing, deleted, she believed. Jalen had an explanation for everything, and yet none of his explanations quite lined up. When Sierra took her concerns to the East Point Police Department, she was met with a response that would haunt her for months. Officers did not mince words. They told her plainly that they were treating Zion's disappearance as a runaway situation. Her daughter had a history of it. She had run to her grandmother's house the year before, not once but twice. The first time she came back voluntarily. The second time, Sierra had called the police. Both times, Zion had turned up safe. To law enforcement, this was pattern behavior. A troubled teenager who would run again. But Sierra knew this was different. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. And so she did what mothers do when institutions fail them. She organized. With the help of family and friends, she launched a community search effort in the days following Zion's disappearance. They posted flyers. They held rallies. They spoke to local media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. "We need your eyes," Sierra told the cameras. "We need your help." Eventually, officers were sent to speak with Jalen Brazier. They found him at home with his long-term girlfriend, Katrina Smith. Jalen invited the police inside and appeared cooperative. He told them he had last seen Zion nearly a year before, back in May of 2021. He framed himself as a peripheral figure, being unfairly dragged into the drama surrounding a teenager with a history of running away. He expressed frustration. He explained that he had offered to show his Ring camera footage to both Sierra and the investigators. He portrayed himself as someone being wrongly accused by an anxious family grasping at any explanation they could find. East Point police found nothing suspicious inside the house. No signs of a struggle. No indication that Zion had ever been there. They departed, apparently satisfied. Jalen may have been fooling the officers, but he was not fooling the neighbors' doorbell cameras. At approximately 11:15 in the evening on January 4th, footage captured from a camera across the street showed a white sedan pulling into the driveway of Jalen Brazier's home. The vehicle was the one known to be driven by Jalen. Emerging from the car were two individuals who walked inside the house together, one male, one female. Here is what made this detail absolutely crucial. Jalen had dropped Katrina off at work just before 11 that night. She was working the midnight shift at a manufacturing facility, a shift that ran from 11 in the evening to 6 in the morning. The woman who walked into Jalen's house at 11:15 could not have been Katrina. She was already at work. Phone location data would later confirm what the footage suggested. The two individuals entering that home were Jalen Brazier and Zion Foster. Zion walked through that front door at 11:15 in the evening, and the camera outside never showed her walking back out. At 1 in the morning, the same camera captured something else. Jalen pulled his car out of the driveway, then reversed it back in, positioning the trunk so that it faced the backyard. The car sat there for a few minutes. Then it drove away. It returned less than 10 minutes later. Investigators obtained search warrants for the house and the vehicle. The search of the house yielded nothing. The contents of Jalen's car were carefully cataloged and examined. No clear physical evidence pointed directly to what had happened to Zion. And then law enforcement brought in the cadaver dogs. The dogs indicated clearly and unmistakably at the trunk of Jalen Brazier's car. On January 19th, 2 weeks after Zion's disappearance, Jalen Brazier walked voluntarily into a police interview room accompanied by a friend who happened to be a lawyer. The jig was up on one front at least. He knew it was obvious he had lied about being with Zion that night. Camera footage, location data, and the cadaver dog all made denial of her presence in his home essentially impossible. So Jalen pivoted. He offered what he called the truthful version of events. He had picked Zion up from her home, he said. They returned to his place. He put his two young boys, aged 1 and 2, to bed upstairs. Then he and Zion settled into the living room to watch television and smoke marijuana. He described a relaxed, ordinary evening. She talked about her relationship with her mother improving. She talked about her boyfriend, about prom, about her job, about saving up for an apartment. Everything was calm. Everything was fine. Then she grew sleepy, her head tilted back. He thought she was dozing off on the couch. He got up to pour himself a drink, came back, and she was unresponsive. He tried to rouse her. Nothing. He checked her pulse. It was faint, then gone. He described her breathing as non-existent.
Very, very faint. And her breathing was like non-existent. So, and mind you, all I smoked, all we had was weed, normal marijuana. So I freaked out. I'm like, okay, well, this looks terrible.
Then he drove home. The detectives in that room listened carefully. They probed the story. They asked him how confident he was that she was actually dead and not simply unconscious. They asked why his first instinct was disposal rather than emergency services. Jalen maintained his account. She was dead, he was certain, and he was terrified. Detectives asked him to show them where. Jalen led them to the area in Highland Park where he claimed to have left Zion's body. She was no longer there. By then, weeks had passed. Trash collection had continued.
And then that he threw her in a dumpster. Like she was trash.
Corroborated one chilling detail of his story. Zion's device dropped off the network at exactly 1 in the morning, corresponding precisely to the time Jalen claimed she had stopped responding to messages from Vertez. That device went with her. It was never found. The next day, January 20th, Jalen returned for a follow-up interview. And that is when his story began to fracture. He now claimed they had not just smoked marijuana that night. They had also taken acid, LSD.
Okay.
I think that's what killed her.
Do you? Did you have like a freaking momentary, like, didn't know what you were doing moment?
No. She also had, she took a time herself.
But let me ask you this. The problem with those drugs are, when you're on them, you don't know what you're doing.
He maintained that he had not harmed her. He had simply found her dead and acted out of fear. Without a confession and without locating Zion's body, there was not yet enough evidence to charge him with murder. Law enforcement instead placed Jalen Brazier under arrest on one count of lying to police. The statements he had made to officers, actively deceiving them regarding his whereabouts, his relationship with Zion, and his interactions with her on the night she disappeared, were enough to hold him. He was sentenced to 23 months in prison for that charge. It was, To many who had followed the case, an outrage. Sierra Milton, watching the man she believed had killed her daughter walk through the justice system on a technicality charge, struggled to find words. The community struggled alongside her, but what happened next, behind the walls of that facility, would ultimately prove to be Jalen's undoing. While incarcerated, Jalen's phone calls home to Katrina and other family members were monitored closely by investigators. He occasionally used other inmates' calling codes in an attempt to disguise the origin of his calls. He was also found to be in possession of a prohibited cell phone, which he used to exchange thousands of messages with Katrina during his time inside. One theme emerged repeatedly in these intercepted conversations. Jalen kept asking whether anything major had happened. It was a thinly veiled inquiry, investigators believed, into whether the ongoing search of the landfill had turned up anything or anyone. In the months following Zion's disappearance, garbage collection trucks that had operated in Highland Park were traced to specific areas of local landfills. An estimated 8-week project was launched to search those landfills. Dozens of volunteers, many in masks and hazmat suits, worked alongside heavy machinery to sift through layer after layer of compacted debris, systematically looking for any sign of Zion Foster. It was an enormous, exhausting, heartbreaking undertaking. From his prison cell, Jalen tracked the project's progress with obvious anxiety. He referred to it obliquely, sometimes calling it the COVID thing, evidently not wanting to say directly what he was asking about. Over and over, he expressed relief when Katrina reported that no major developments had occurred. For a man who claimed that Zion had simply died of natural causes in his living room, this was a telling posture. If his story was true, if she had died of some sudden and inexplicable medical event that had nothing to do with him, then the discovery of her body would vindicate him entirely. He should have been desperate for her to be found. Instead, he appeared desperate for her to remain hidden. After serving just over 9 months, Jalen was granted early release through a 90-day boot camp program designed for rehabilitation. He returned home. The landfill search had ended without finding Zion. No murder indictment had been sought. The prime suspect walked back to his family, back to his children, back to his life. Why is this man free? Sierra Milton asked publicly, and the question echoed across every news outlet and social media platform that had followed the case. It would not last. On June 13, 2023, after a year and a half of investigation, the Detroit Police Department, assisted by the FBI, was finally granted a warrant for Jalen Brazier's arrest on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. And it was what investigators found in the digital shadows of his devices that made the case truly chilling. Despite the factory reset that Jalen had performed on his phone just 2 days after Zion's disappearance, effectively wiping its contents, his search history had been preserved in cloud storage. On January 7th, 3 days after he dumped his young cousin's body in a dumpster in Highland Park, Jalen had conducted a series of Google searches. Are garbage trucks also compactors? What is the force of a garbage truck compactor? How do police get your phone history? And how do you know if police are watching you? These were not the searches of a man racked with guilt over an accidental death. These were the searches of someone methodically assessing whether the evidence against him would survive. But there was more. Investigators discovered that in the months leading up to January 4th, Jalen had conducted searches for pornographic content containing the words cousin and step-cousin. Some of the video results retrieved from those searches were described by investigators as very violent and deeply graphic in nature. The picture being assembled was not one of a cousin, but of a predator. Then came the messages found on Zion's old cell phone, which Sierra had turned over to police. Over 4,000 text messages retrieved from the device painted a portrait of years of calculated grooming. Jalen had routinely invited Zion to his home while Katrina was away. He offered to let her live in his basement if she ran away from home, and coached her on how to evade police if she did so. He told Zion that Katrina was jealous of her. He suggested to the teenager that other people thought the two of them were a couple. He called himself a god. He complimented her appearance and her intelligence in ways that blurred every appropriate boundary between cousins. The messages ranged, according to Wayne County Assistant Prosecutor Ryan Elsey, from subtle and unsettling to deeply inappropriate and explicitly sexual. Prosecutor Elsey told the jury plainly, Jalen had been grooming his younger cousin for years. He had fantasized about her, and on the night of January 4th, 2022, he had acted on those impulses. This was the motive. This was the twisted obsession that had led to Zion Foster's death. There was one final piece of evidence that seemed to tie the timeline together in a devastating way. On the same day that Jalen brought Zion to his house, Katrina had discovered she was pregnant with their third child. Earlier that evening, her nausea and hot spells had sent her to the emergency room. She messaged Jalen repeatedly from work that night, feeling too ill to continue her shift. At 1 in the morning, she wrote, "I think I need to come home." At 1:26, "I don't feel good. Minutes later, my stomach hurts. I feel sick and keep getting hot and cold." Jalen's response was a single dismissive line, "You can make it, baby." He finally picked her up from work at nearly 3 in the morning. When he did, Katrina noticed something that troubled her. There was a deep scratch across his collarbone, fresh enough to have drawn blood. He told her the cat had done it. Odd, she thought. The cat had never scratched that deeply before. The trial lasted 2 full weeks in May of 2024. Jalen Brazier chose not to testify. The prosecution called 32 witnesses. The defense called none. The case against him was largely circumstantial, and yet it was overwhelming in its totality. A forensic anthropologist who reviewed Zion's complete medical history determined that the only condition she had ever been diagnosed with that could conceivably have led to sudden death was asthma. But an asthma attack, the expert explained, would present in the exact opposite manner of what Jalen described. Zion would have been visibly struggling to breathe. She would not have quietly drifted off and faded away. She would have been clearly and undeniably in distress. The defense tried to introduce the theory of an undiagnosed seizure condition. Vertez had testified in an earlier hearing that Zion told him she suffered from seizures and took medication for them, and that without the medication, they became worse. He had once seen her become momentarily faint, slouching forward briefly before recovering, and believed this might have been a seizure. The defense leaned on this. Maybe Zion had a condition that neither her mother nor her medical records reflected. Maybe she had experienced a fatal seizure in Jalen's living room. Sierra Milton, whose youngest child actually was diagnosed with a seizure disorder, was unequivocal. Zion had never had a seizure. Hundreds of pages of medical records supported her. Vertez himself admitted during trial that Zion had a tendency to exaggerate and tell stories. It seemed likely she had borrowed her younger sibling's diagnosis to make herself seem more interesting, more sympathetic. She liked to tell stories, he said quietly. The prosecutor's closing argument was direct and devastating. He reminded jurors that marijuana possession at that time carried roughly the equivalent of a parking ticket. He asked them to consider whether any reasonable person disposes of a body to avoid getting caught with marijuana. He walked them through the scratch on Jalen's collarbone. He walked them through the Google searches 3 days after Zion died. He walked them through 4,000 messages of calculated grooming. He walked them through the surveillance footage showing Zion entering the house and never leaving. She left that house in the trunk of his car, the prosecutor told the jury, on a night when he had an unexplained gash across his collarbone. You tell me what happened inside that house. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes. Guilty on count 1, guilty on count 2. At his sentencing hearing, Jalen Brazier maintained his innocence. He told the court that Zion's death had not been violent in any way. He claimed he had tried to apologize, that he had been scared, that he had never been in a situation like that before and hadn't known what to do. He spoke of his children upstairs. He spoke of the apartment he and Katrina had struggled for years to secure, and how everything seemed to be falling down around him in those terrible minutes. Judge Donald Knapp was unmoved. Before announcing the sentence, the judge outlined clearly and methodically everything Jalen had failed to account for. His refusal to accept responsibility for the murder itself, his disposal of Zion's body, his lies to police and to family, the months of delay those lies caused in the investigation, his decision to leave his 2 toddler sons alone in the house while he drove to Highland Park and disposed of a young woman's remains, his manipulation of everyone around him, including the girlfriend who was pregnant with his child, while he was bringing Zion home. Judge Knapp concluded that it was unlikely Jalen Brazier would ever be rehabilitated. Jalen Brazier was sentenced to 30 to 90 years in prison for the murder of Zion Foster and an additional 5 to 10 years for tampering with evidence. The terms were to be served consecutively. In the gallery, Sierra Milton's body trembled as the sentences were read. Then she spoke. She said she was happy, not because happiness was the right word for any of this, but because her daughter had been seen, had been fought for, had been loved, and in the end, the jury had seen exactly what Jalen Brazier was.
It was red. And it was just so matter of fact. I was so happy they saw. She was loved. She is loved. She was fought for. And this is the result. So I'm happy. I'm happy that in the end, this is justice.
And for Jalen, you thought you were smart. You tried to be slick. The people saw you for what you are. You ain't. And I hope you never get out.
Zion Foster's body has never been recovered. More than 70 volunteers and law enforcement personnel searched a landfill outside of Detroit for nearly 6 months before the search was officially suspended. The garbage compactor trucks that Jaylen researched on his phone 3 days after her death had done their work. The physical evidence that might have told the full story of what happened inside that house on the night of January 4th was destroyed long before investigators could reach it. What we know is this: a 17-year-old girl left her house just before 11 in the evening, trusting a man she considered family. She walked through his front door at 11:15. She never walked back out. At 1 in the morning, her phone went dark. Her 2-word text message, "On my way," was the last thing anyone who loved her ever received from her. What happened inside that house remains, in precise forensic terms, unknown. But the jury heard 32 witnesses. They reviewed 4,000 messages. They heard about internet searches and cadaver dogs and a scratch across a collarbone and a man who, while his pregnant girlfriend begged to come home from work sick, told her she could make it because he was otherwise occupied. They deliberated for 30 minutes. The case of Zion Foster is a story about the specific and devastating danger of misplaced trust, and about the kind of predator who disguises himself as family. Jaylen Brazier spent years cultivating access to a young woman who trusted him, a young woman who used his name as a cover story because she believed she was safe with him, because she had known him her entire life. That trust, carefully constructed and patiently maintained, was what ultimately put her in the wrong place on the wrong night. Sierra Milton fought for her daughter from the moment she realized something was wrong. When police dismissed her, when the search yielded nothing, when the prime suspect walked free, she never stopped. And when a jury of 12 people returned a guilty verdict in 30 minutes, Sierra Milton stood in that courtroom as proof that a mother's refusal to accept silence can matter. Zion Foster was 17 years old. She was a senior at East Detroit High School. She had just celebrated her birthday in November. She was talking about prom, about her boyfriend, about getting her own apartment. She had her whole life ahead of her. Jaylen Brazier will be eligible for parole consideration when he is in his 50s, at the earliest, more likely his 70s, given the consecutive nature of his sentences. The judge who sentenced him made